was a nuclear war. A few years from now.
It was the machines. Defense network computers. Hooked into everything. Trusted to run it all. They say it got smart. A new order of intelligence. Then it saw all people as a threat, not just the ones on the other side. It decided our fate in a microsecond.
Anything else?
A phased plasma rifle in the 40-watt range.
Hey, just what you see, pal.
I'm here to help you. I'm Reese, Sergeant TechCom, BN 38416, assigned to protect you. You've been targeted for termination.
I didn't do anything.
No, but you will.
How could that man just get up after you did?
It's not a man. Machine. Terminator. Cyberdyne Systems Model 101.
Like a robot?
Not a robot. Cyborg. Cybernetic organism. The Terminator's an infiltration unit. Part man, part machine. Underneath it's a hyperalloy combat chassis. Microprocessor controlled. Fully armored. Very tough. But outside it's living human tissue. That Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear. And it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
In late October of 1984, The Terminator arrived in cinemas and became a surprise hit for Orion Pictures, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had become a Hollywood star thanks to the success of Conan the Barbarian 2 years earlier. Directed by James Cameron, who was to many an unknown, having only directed Piranha 2, The Terminator's mix of horror and science fiction garnered it critical acclaim and kickstarted a massive franchise. But back in 1984, no one had thought of producing a video game based on the movie. But this was a time when film studios didn't see the potential in video games and only saw it as a licensing option, like toys and t-shirts, and saw no value in it. The likes of Activision, Atari and Ocean Software knew there was big money to be made and were starting to take advantage of licensing movies and turning them into games. The Terminator, with its explosive action, with a hero called Kyle Reese at the centre to save Sarah Connor from the unstoppable cyborg, would seem easy to translate into a fun action game. Ocean would acquire Robocop from Orion Pictures in 1987, but the Terminator was off the radar, but it wasn't until 1988 that a games developer saw the potential. In an extensive article written in December 2020 by Stefan Ganser, he discovered that Sunsoft of America were the first to attempt to translate the movie to the Nintendo Entertainment System, picking up the license in 1988 from Creative Licensing Corporation, CLC. As Sunsoft saw the film could be a successful game despite it being 4 years old at that point. The development of the game would be handled by Sunsoft staff in Japan, who had the very ambitious idea of taking inspiration from the Laserdisc game Dragon's Lair, which was a cartoon that the player in a limited way interacted with the game, allowing them to choose what to do when prompted. Obviously, the Nintendo couldn't handle such unique graphics or run full motion video, so the game would play out as a scaled down version with cutscenes with interactive moments. The team had to adhere to some severe restrictions in making the game, dictated by the license holder CLC. The Terminator could not die at any time other than at the end of the game, just like in the movie, and there could be no enemy characters other than the Terminator in the game. Due to their limitations of memory for the console, their plans to make a full-length game with these cutscenes proved too difficult, as they ran out of memory, and Sunsoft weren't willing to invest in more memory, so the decision was to scrap this idea and start over. Examples of these cutscenes were shown at CES in 1989 as part of a promo video.
We're bringing the Terminator back in the biggest way possible, as the very first home video game to feature movie footage and interactive graphics technology.
They started making an action game instead that would fit within the limitations of the allowed memory of the Famicom, aka the Nintendo, but the change of genre also made it impossible to adhere to the license holder's requirements, so the developers set the game in the future, where the player could fight off other enemies before meeting the Terminator. Later that year, a finished build of the game was presented to CLC. They weren't happy and revoked the license because the game did not follow the plot of the original film. The movie is mainly set in 1984, while the game was set in the future. The developers at Sunsoft were fully aware that the game was not going to pass the requirements, so they just focused on making a good action game that was at least set in the universe of the movie. After losing the license, Sunsoft decided not to scrap the game and renamed it and replaced the cutscenes. At first the game was called Operation SSS for the US market, but was changed once again to Journey to Silius. As you can see, the stage design very much fits the future war in Terminator, and a number of the enemy sprites look very similar to the robots featured in the film. Years later, fans made great attempts to return the game to its original design, creating new cutscenes and sprites to match the film, and you can play as Kyle Reese. It still isn't like the film, as the stages are very much set in the future, but the core gameplay is a lot of fun, and it's great to see fans have taken the extra steps to try and replicate what NES owners could have got at the time if the license holders weren't so strict. As Sunsoft had lost the license, Bethesda managed to acquire it from Hemdale Film Corporation in 1990 and began producing a game for the MS-DOS home computer, with plans to release it in July of 1991, in time for the release of the highly anticipated Terminator 2 Judgment Day. It will later be picked up by US Gold for UK distribution. As Sunsoft struggled to adhere to the strict rules, Bethesda followed the plot of the movie closely and stuck to the licensee's instructions. You can choose to play as Kyle Reese, who was already dressed by the way, with the mission to protect Sarah from the Terminator, or take on the role of the cyborg with the task of eliminating Kyle and Sarah. There is an easy mode, for example. If you play as a Terminator, you are already armed. Either way, the player chases his opponent throughout LA, buying or stealing weapons and equipment, while attempting to eliminate his enemy and avoiding the police. Though if you start stealing too much, the police arrive quickly. You can gain more cash by robbing a bank, but you will have to deal with far more police than stealing. As Kyle, you can even have a dog which will let you know if the Terminator is nearby. The game takes place in a huge 3D rendered area of central LA. A game map is included in the box for reference. According to the game's end credits, the game was written in 100% assembly. The game contains approximately 20,000 3D objects. It was developed using a turbo assembler and turbo debugger. It was created on a variety of 286 and 386 computers. All graphics were created on IBMs and Amigas. More than 700 frames of animations were created. Outside of the 3D graphics, the artist provided detailed pixel art for the cutscenes, such as the opening to the game and when you are either killed by the Terminator or you defeat him. Once entering a building, you can interact with it by picking up items, though most of the items have no function. The game does feature music at the start, which isn't too bad for the time, but during the game there is no music, just crude sound effects. On release, the game was given mixed reviews, with Meme Machines awarding it a strong 88%. They felt the game was extremely faithful to the movie, though they said protecting Sarah Connor was a nightmare. Even firing one bullet in the game, the cops will arrive sharpish and start shooting you, and the 3D visuals would go a bit haywire from time to time, and trying to figure out what to do in the game wasn't fun due to the lousy manual. But with dedication, getting your head around the controls made for a more enjoyable experience. Other magazines felt far differently, in particular PC Review. In their first issue, they gave it 1 out of 10, saying the game seemed developed before they got the Terminator license, as none of the pace or atmosphere of the film has been captured. You just walk around an unconvincing first-person representation of LA, looking for Sarah or avoiding the Terminator. They felt the concept was good, but didn't suit the style of the movie. Bethesda would improve upon their concept and follow up the game with Terminator 2029 in 1992, Terminator Rampage in 93, Future Shock in 95, and their final game, the Terminator Skynet, in 96, which all take place in the future war.
Imagine being as powerful, as ruthless, as thoroughly unpleasant as the Terminator. Unfortunately, on Sega, you're the nice guy. So to be any good really is gonna take ages.
Virgin Games were interested in bringing the Terminator to the Sega Mega Drive, Master System, Game Gear, and eventually the Mega CD. They would sub-license it through Bethesda, and the same would happen for the NES and Super Nintendo games, with Mindscape as the publisher. In an interview with Retro Gamer in issue 232, the programmer David Perry had just started working at Probe Software, which was founded in 1984, the same year the film was released, and the company had a decent reputation developing games for the Amstrad, Commodore 64 and Spectrum, before making the leap to consoles. Firmus McGovern, the founder of Probe, was a whiz at getting licensing deals and managed to secure the license for the Terminator for the Sega consoles. The team was set to make the most ambitious tie-in yet, but it became clear Orion Pictures had some strict rules, which would hamper the artistic direction of David and his fellow developers. David wanted the game to focus around the Terminator, but Orion stipulated that they didn't have the rights to put Arnold in the game. They had one image they could use for the box art, so he suggested playing as Sarah Connor. Again, Orion did not have the rights to her likeness. The studio mandated it had to be Kyle Reese, who dies in the film, which disappointed the team, but that didn't stop them from trying to create a faithful translation of the movie. To create the movements, David Perry and game producer Neil Young were filmed performing the moves. The footage was then digitized in black and white onto an Amiga computer. With the use of deluxe paint, the actors were separated from the backgrounds and colorized before being added into the game. Composer Matt Furness would handle the game's music, which tries to replicate the score by Brad Fiedel for the opening of the game, but shifts to his own original material for the main game, making the most of the Mega Drive's Yamaha sound chip, creating some memorable 16-bit tracks. The first level, though not part of the film, is capturing the flashback sequences, playing as Kyle, who is instructed to destroy Skynet and escape in the time displacement unit. You get attacked from every direction. Once in the base, you have endless amounts of Terminators. You can take out a bunch of them by letting off a timed explosion, in which you have a limited number of. Once it goes off, the Terminators fly off the screen, which is very amusing. Also, having your character jump is quite hilarious. Kyle looks like he's sitting on an invisible toilet. The Terminators will drop health randomly. Sometimes they never drop any and you find yourself dead in a few minutes. To make the process of getting past them quicker is to grab the machine gun on the far left, which requires getting past a mini robot. If you set the difficulty to easy, the gun is available on the right once you enter the base. Once you've got the gun, it's clean sailing, but you only have one life, and you'll find yourself dying a lot on the first stage. But once you get past that level, it gets a lot easier, and you'll find yourself completing the game in no time. When in the past, it's fun playing as Kyle with a shotgun, but be aware firing while standing up. There is a delay as the animation has him pull out the gun out of his jacket, and by that point you've been shot or had a Molotov cocktail thrown on your head. Best to duck and fire each time as there is no delay. They chose to ignore two action sequences, both driving segments as the Terminator chases them by car then by motorbike, which would have required a bit more development time, but it would have been nice for them to include those moments to just break up the gameplay and provide variety. After the police station shootout, you face off against the Terminator and make him follow you into the compressor. The Terminator arrived on the Mega Drive/Genesis in February 1992 in the USA and the UK in August of that year. The game mostly got positive reviews praising its graphics and sound quality, but many pointed out with frustration that it was too short and easy to complete, with Julian Jazz Rignall being the most disappointed, giving it a score of 43% despite giving it high ratings for everything else. Other magazines were far less harsh, with CVG awarding it 91%, Sega Force 84%, and Sega Power with 87%. The game went on to sell very well thanks to the strong IP, but also Virgin Games did make efforts to advertise it on TV, and in France there was a very elaborate commercial for it. As many copies of the game were produced, it can still be found online very cheap. Virgin still saw there was money to be made in the Master System, that still had a strong following in Europe and Brazil, and ported the game to the 8-bit console, with it arriving in August of 92, and the Brazilian release would arrive in June of 1994. Programmed by Dominic Wood, this version would follow the template of the Mega Drive version, again consisting of 4 levels, but would have some changes to the levels to provide some platforming. The game wasn't a cutback version and included all the cutscenes to tell the story. They removed the large sprite of the Hunter-Killer at the beginning, and the rest of the sprites were smaller in scale. But it was a very competent version to stand next to the mighty Mega Drive. The Game Gear version would arrive later in October in the USA and November in the UK of 92. The Game Gear version would basically be the same as the Master System release, with a zoomed in image to fill the Game Gear screen, as the Master System game had a wider playing field, which would make the gameplay difficult to see on the handheld device, but this also caused issues, as the Master System version gave you the chance to see what enemies were coming. The Game Gear version, you would have to be quick off the draw to shoot them, and often you would get hit first as they just quickly appear on screen. To combat this problem, you essentially take less damage, giving you more of a fighting chance. There are some minor changes to the enemy placements in the game. In the police station, once on the roof, you get a helicopter dropping bombs on you, which doesn't happen in the Mega Drive version. Coming face to face with the Terminator for the final stage, you don't have to lead him into the crusher. You find him there at the end and just have to shoot him. He basically gets stun locked and falls into it, making it super easy. Also, there's no health pickups. You get your life restored once you walk into another part of the stage. For example, on stage 1, once you blow the door open to gain access to the next section, and the screen flicks onto the next part of the stage, your health is restored. Both the Game Gear and Master System versions experience slowdown. As you have the character running, the game appears to perform smoothly, and then suddenly the frame rate dips, bringing it to a crawl for a short moment. This happens throughout the game, but it surprisingly doesn't affect the gameplay and is not that off-putting. The 8-bit versions fared far better than the Mega Drive version with the critics, with the majority of the reviews awarding it around 80%. They didn't complain of its short length or its easy difficulty. The quality of the graphics and solid gameplay seemed perfect for the 8-bit console and handheld, whereas the Mega Drive version many were expecting it to be far bigger due to the power of the console and the larger asking price for the game. Games publisher Mindscape had the rights to produce Terminator for the NES and Super Nintendo, with Radical Entertainment handling the coding on the NES, and Mindscape would handle the Super Nintendo version with assistance from Grey Matter. As the developers of the Sega versions only dedicated 4 levels to the player, Mindscape would offer more levels and variety to the gameplay, though both ignored the Tech Noir Club, but ultimately it didn't make either the NES or SNES versions better games. The NES game would arrive in the USA in December of 1992, though it was reviewed by the UK gaming press in May of '93, there is no evidence of it actually being released in Europe. The only images are from the US version, with it being a late release in the console's life. Not many copies were produced. The NES game featured 11 stages, starting out in the future, working your way up from the sewers avoiding Terminators, then on land, which leads you to the driving section avoiding shots from the hunter-killers, then you find yourself in a bland brick building avoiding random spikes until you reach the time machine. Back in 1984, you have to get past the police, dogs and punks on the streets as you enter the mall, where in the film he finds his clothes. Then on the roof you work your way down to find Sarah. The game switches to a top-down view as you get chased by the Terminator. Once you are arrested, you escape with Sarah from the police station, and again you are chased by the Terminator in another driving section, until you find yourself in the factory, where you get to go into hand-to-hand combat with the Terminator before he is inevitably crushed. You never actually get to see Arnold as a sprite. I'm not sure if the ones at the beginning count, but he is greatly missing from the game, and only appears as part of a static image to continue the story. The game reviewed poorly across the board, looking dated and ugly in the graphics department, and the music and sound effects are grating on one's ears. It probably has one of the worst soundtracks I've ever heard on the NES. Once you complete it, there is no credits to show you who worked on the game. I suppose no one wanted their name attached to this turkey. To give the game credit, it at least tries to offer more than the Sega versions, but if it's difficult to control and play, it doesn't matter how long the game is, and it demonstrated that by throwing more into the game, it didn't result in a fun experience for the player. CVG awarded it 61%, telling their readers to give it a miss, summing it up as a boring platformer with far better examples on the old console. The Super Nintendo game arrived in April of 1993, and again it's unclear if it ever got a UK release, despite being reviewed in May of that year. The only evidence of a PAL version is from Germany. The SNES would follow a similar stage layout to the NES version. The combat in the future is very much inspired by Contra, but less fun. You find yourself getting overwhelmed by Terminators and all sorts of random robots. Most folk probably struggle to get past the first level, as it goes on for too long. The rest of the platforming in 1984 is a nightmare, and the driving sections, though look far better than its NES counterpart, are extremely difficult to survive for more than a minute. It can be done, but takes some persistence. The game's music, thankfully, is not awful. It does have some decent sound samples, and some eerie sound effects on the future levels, though it does sound like someone's stomach is rumbling. The game doesn't make use of Brad Fidell's main theme, though uses the score composed for the factory sequence for the main title of the game. The SNES version was critiqued for its high difficulty and dated graphics. It hardly looked 16-bit. It had frustrating gameplay, in particular with Kyle Reese making his way across the buildings with many leaps of faith having to be made to continue and often dying in the process. The novelty of the driving sections wore off after a few minutes, making the whole experience of playing the game a chore. The official Nintendo magazine in the UK gave it 47%, saying shambling, drab and undercooked. Everything a game licensed to such a major film shouldn't be. Avoid this at all costs. CVG were less harsh, awarding it 70%, complaining it was just too difficult, had dodgy sprites, and the bland backdrops gave it a 8-bit feel. And the last game that will be based on the 1984 film will be the Sega/Mega CD version that arrived in the USA in June of 1993 and in January of 94 for the UK. The Mega CD version is how these CD upgrades should be. For the majority of the time, the games on the Sega add-on would essentially be the Mega Drive version with Red Book audio and a few FMV cutscenes, essentially making these deluxe versions, and many gamers and critics felt it wasn't really worth upgrading to the Mega CD, but the Terminator was completely changed from the ground up. New level and sprite design, more stages, everything felt bigger. They would have a larger team working on this release with a lot more artists involved, with David Perry returning to assist with the programming. The original Mega Drive version dedicated 1 level to the future war. The CD version gave you 4 levels, with 2 out in the wasteland and 2 inside Skynet. As you get there a minute too late as you see the T-800 go through the time displacement unit, you then follow after him after defeating the boss character. Once arriving in 1984, you have to work your way through 2 levels on the streets until you reach Tech Noir. After getting past the Terminator, you then have to escape from the police station and battle your way through the factory, which features 2 levels, mostly avoiding these machines that attack you until the Terminator makes his appearance. Once you've blown his legs off, we see Sarah flicking the switch to crush the cyborg. The Mega Drive game could be completed in say 15 minutes. The Mega CD version could take you nearly an hour. They of course include FMV clips from the Terminator film, which are a grainy mess, but at the time it was still a nice novelty. But in hindsight, it would have been nice for them to have created original animated sequences. The game is well known for its rocking soundtrack by Tommy Tallarico, who produced a number of tracks for the game and supervised the music, with additional songs contributed by other artists, such as Joey Carras and Brad Fidel, though the Terminator theme seems to be a re-recording, not the original theme from the movie's soundtrack album. The game utilised Q Sound to create a 3D soundscape. Capcom would famously start using it for their CPS2 hardware with the introduction of Super Street Fighter 2. Tallarico said the game's graphics were still very much 16-bit looking, and the music you'd hear would be like music on the radio or an album, and it was a bit jarring. Tommy said I would get into screaming matches with the producers because they told me they didn't want that proper music in the game. They said it doesn't sound like a video game, and Tommy said exactly, it doesn't have to anymore. Virgin were ultimately so impressed with the music it got its own release. The Mega CD version is today a must-have title for the Mega Drive add-on, but at the time the reviews were not too enthusiastic. Mega Magazine awarded it 67%, saying it's a well-presented blast, but boring and very samey and a bit of a waste. Sega Power gave it a lower score of 58%, saying the graphics are awful, there was loads of better platform shoot-em-ups on the Mega Drive, the music is great, but that can't save the game. GamePro magazine thankfully saw the positives, saying the smooth sprite animation and the great backgrounds make this a visual treat, and will keep you fascinated and frustrated for hours. It's unclear if the game sold well, but it has become a hot collector's item and fetches well over £150 now, especially the UK version due to its superior artwork. My first experience playing the Terminator games was on the Sega Mega Drive as a kid, and first seeing it I thought it looked amazing. The graphics were awesome and the action was non-stop. I loved it when Reese fired that shotgun at a fast rate. It made such a cool sound effect, and my friend clearly knew I liked it, and said if I wanted to swap games with him. I had Two Crude Dudes, which wasn't a great game, but I enjoyed it at the time and had just finished it. So we traded games, and once I got home I found myself completing the Terminator in about 20 minutes on my first go. I was really gutted. My friend obviously didn't tell me it was a painfully short game. Despite it being a quick game to play through, I have gone back to it many times over the years. I think because of its short nature it is easy to pick up and play. When you are older and have less time, playing a game such as this is a great way to chill out and to get that quick fix of retro gaming. But back in 1992 when it came out, paying like £40 for it would have felt like a major rip-off, considering how painfully short it was. The Master System and Game Gear ports are surprisingly good. They are very close to the Mega Drive version and retain the gameplay with hardly any cutbacks. They do have a different colour palette in stage design, and the sprites are smaller, but this port makes for a nice alternative, and are strong titles for those 8-bit machines. The DOS game is one I heard about but never knew anyone who owned it, and only experienced it years later. It is a weird one. It's certainly very ambitious and ahead of its time with its ideas, but doesn't really provide an enjoyable experience. It has wonderful detailed cutscenes, but once you are in that 3D world, it's too slow and clunky to get around. It's difficult to make out who is who with the 3D characters. The bright colourful 3D world doesn't feel like you're playing a Terminator game, more like a crude Lego game. The vast number of functions on the keyboard make it difficult to remember how to control the game as well. There are certainly fans of it who experienced it back in the day and have that nostalgia for it, but playing it now, you would only do it out of curiosity. It's pretty obvious the Nintendo versions are best avoided, especially the NES game, which is a massive turd. It does, to its credit, try to be faithful to the film by expanding upon the flashback sequences to battle hunter killers and has the 2 chases with the Terminator, but it's frustrating to play with clunky controls, involving pixel-perfect jumping, contains ugly graphics, especially for a late release in a console's life, and horrendous music, up there as one of the worst licensed titles. The SNES version is not quite as bad as the NES game, but it's still a stinker. It does incorporate some nice cutscenes for the opening of the game and first level, but they soon drop that idea and just feature, like the Mega Drive version, digital stills from the film. The first level is ludicrously long, with the Terminators popping up out of nowhere and firing non-stop. The Terminator sprites move around like they are busting for the toilet. You face off against a hunter-killer, thinking this is the end boss of the level, but oh no, it continues on. Such awful game design throughout, the other levels are just horrible and repetitive. It's not a fun experience, and I was glad when I finally finished it. The final stage appears at first to be the closest to the movie than all the other games, as Kyle avoids the Terminator by bashing him with a lead pipe and then attaches the bomb to it and dies on explosion. But the Terminator also is defeated and is not crushed in the process by Sarah. It was nearly there but messed it up at the end. The one I would highly recommend, and I'm sure most will agree, is the Mega CD version. Great graphics with awesome backgrounds and smooth animation. It does a great job of expanding the Mega Drive game by basically offering more stages to each setting, though again they avoid the car chases, which would have been cool if done in the same fashion as Batman Returns on the Mega CD, but I'm guessing that would have cost more money in development time and coding. The FMV sequences are not needed, they are super grainy and barely watchable, but the music and presentation is top notch. The platform gameplay is fast and action packed, though shooting in different directions isn't as flexible as one would want. You have to be in the right position for the character to aim up at a certain angle. It's not as freewheeling as it should be. The game isn't amazing, it's just a solid platformer that makes the best efforts to provide a game that focuses on Kyle Reese's story, and the results are a strong licensed title that is certainly worth playing. What could have made these Terminator games great was if the license holder was far less strict on the developers. We didn't see Orion Pictures being difficult with Data East and Ocean Software on Robocop, I suppose down to them not having Arnold's likeness. Things quickly became problematic, but I'm sure there could have been workarounds. Having the option to play as the Terminator as well on the console games, it would have provided a larger game. The opportunity to play as the cyborg from the future gunning down the police instead of Kyle Reese would have made more sense. And then chasing after Kyle and Sarah by car and motorbike, it could have made a more exciting game. Then you have 2 endings, one with a dark finale and the proper ending with Sarah destroying the Terminator. Lots of potential there, but sadly none fully took advantage of this great license. But at the end of the day, if you intend to go back to play the Terminator, stick with Sega. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button and click the bell to be notified of my latest retrospectives and reviews. Big thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel. If you want to get involved and gain early access to my content and exclusive videos, then follow the link below.